In this lesson series, we'll do an introduction to the brain, the organ that detects important stimuli, integrates information, and generates adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is behavior that helps the organism survive and reproduce in an evolutionary context. Now, we know the brain resides in the skull, and if you remove the skull, you see something like this. The brain has a tough outer covering, and underneath you can see through that covering to the surface of the brain. Here's a different look, a cross-section through a human head. This is from the Body Worlds type of exhibit, and we see the brain here. Now, the brain, of course, sits atop the spinal cord, and the spinal cord contains nerves that interact with the body. Back to the brain. The surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and we'll be focusing in this course on some of the functioning of some of these regions in the cerebral cortex. The cerebellum is back here. We're not going to say much about the cerebellum in this course. The brain has two hemispheres. So the front of the brain would be here, the back of the brain here. So this is the right hemisphere looking from the top, and the left hemisphere. And while we don't have to memorize these right now, the surface of the cortex is divided into lobes: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. If we turn the brain upside down, we see the undersurface of the brain. So here we see the bottom of the temporal lobe merging back to the occipital lobe here. Again, here's the cerebellum, and here's the bottom of the frontal lobe. Now, brains are composed of parts. So if you take a bit of brain tissue and put it under the microscope, you're going to see cells called neurons. So neurons are brain cells. And neurons themselves, as cells, are composed of molecules. Non-living molecules are the building blocks of cells. Cells are the building blocks of brains. So now let's look at the basic parts of a brain cell, a neuron. And again, we'll go into the deeper level of the biology of this in a later lesson. But the basics are as follows. This would be a living cell in the brain called a neuron. The neuron has a cell body that has the nucleus where DNA would be. And it's got these branching structures, kind of like the branches of a tree, that are called dendrites. Then it has this long nerve fiber called an axon, and then the terminal of the axon. Now, the different parts of a neuron have different jobs. The dendrites receive chemical signals from many other neurons and converts them to electrical signals. The sites of contact are called synapses. So these branching tree-like structures are called dendrites. They are the input zone, the receiving zone of a brain cell. Brain cells are going to be getting information from hundreds or thousands of other brain cells. Here we see this is a neuron, and here are all the dendrites. Here's one of the dendrites here, and here is the input, the axon of another neuron making a synapse, a junction with this target neuron. Now, the cell body integrates the electrical activity of all inputs from the synapses and decides, that's metaphorical, they're not conscious, decides whether or not to generate an electrical signal. So the cell body is positioned, in a sense, to integrate all of the information arriving at the synapses on its many dendrites. In this picture then, here's the cell body. Notice then all the dendrites originate from the cell body, and so any electrical signals being generated on the dendrites are, in a sense, going to be added up, and they will be the neuron will make a decision as to whether to respond with its own electrical signal. That output signal is carried along the axon. So the axon moves the output electrical signal down the axon terminal, and the axon terminal releases chemicals called neurotransmitters that generate an electrical signal in the target cell. Now, there was a historical controversy early on when microscopists put brain tissue under the microscope and then stained brain cells. It just looked like a tangled forest, and they couldn't identify individual brain cells. It looked like perhaps they might be physically connected. But with better microscopes, scientists came to the conclusion that, in fact, brain cells are separate cells. So neurons are separate cells, although they make these close connections with others at the junction called the synapse. And neurons communicate with other neurons by releasing chemicals across the synapse, and the chemicals generate an electrical response. So brain cells are operating with a combination of electricity and chemistry. Now, interestingly, neuron shape and function can change. So the connections can get stronger and also weaker. And this feature of neurons can explain how we learn and remember. And we'll take up that point in later lessons. So the neurons are changeable. Their shape and their function it can be modified. And this accounts for our ability to learn and remember things. Just to illustrate the electrical nature of neurons, we'll take one example here. Underneath the temporal cortex is a structure called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus and the surrounding cortex of the temporal lobe are really important in memory processing. And we know this because damage to this region of the brain interferes with making new memories. Patients with damage to the hippocampus and surrounding tissue cannot make new memories of their lives. They have what psychologists call anterograde amnesia. But for our purposes, we're just going to illustrate that scientists have made great strides in understanding how brain cells operate. So here we see the hippocampus in a drawing. This is a real brain, cross-section of the brain, and this region is the hippocampus. And here we see that same region stained for individual cells. In fact, we'll see closer up, this is the hippocampus of a rat. This picture was a human. That's a human hippocampus here and here. And this is a rat hippocampus, and it has a similar structure to the human hippocampus. But here we can see greater magnification. The purple stained objects are hippocampal brain cells. Now, the interesting thing about this is that a couple decades ago, scientists were able to devise techniques to manipulate slices of hippocampal tissue. And so this is a slice of a rat hippocampus, and it's kept alive in this solution here long enough so that scientists can study the electrical and chemical properties of neurons. So scientists have advanced our understanding of how brain cells operate because of techniques like this. They can keep brain cells alive in a dish and then stimulate them with electrical impulses and record their electrical activity and use drugs and chemicals to influence cell communication. So great strides have been made in understanding the electrical and chemical properties of neurons. So sometimes when you see brain cells sort of in the popular media, you'll see a picture like this. Here's a brain cell, and then you got these sort of glowing parts along some of the fibers here. These would be the electrical signals that a brain cell might be receiving or generating. So for our purposes right now, we just want to think of brain cells as electrically excitable. They also use chemistry to communicate with each other, and these are living cells that make up our brain.